Motions, motion. Mr. Cullen, seconded by Mr. Bulris, moves that the third report of the Special Committee on Electoral Reform presented on Thursday, December 1st, 2016, be concurred in. Debate. The Honourable Member for Skeena-Balclay Valley.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. At the outset, just to let you know, I'll be sharing my time with my colleague from Rosemont-le-Petit-Patrie, who has done excellent work on this file and is joined by tens of thousands of Canadians who have also contributed their hearts, their ideas, their hopes and aspirations into this issue, into this idea, a most fundamental idea, that when you vote for something, that you would get it. That when you put your ballot in the ballot box, expressing your wish for the future, which is what a vote is, and there's been a promise made, that that promise will be kept. We have watched the long and somewhat tortured saga of this story around electoral reform in this government for many months now, 18, 20 months or more, in which we had the opportunity to do something, and we have that opportunity still, to do something quite remarkable in restoring the hope and trust that Canadians have in their politics, in their governance, in their way of doing things here in Parliament. Perhaps what we are attempting to do here today with this vote on the Electoral Reform Committee's work is to have Liberals keep their promise. Some have said that's one of the trickiest jobs in politics. I disagree. Well, no, the evidence is actually quite strong that this is a hard thing to sometimes do, yet I have a great amount of hope that is shared by many Canadians that this can be done. That the reason many of us got into elected office in the first place was to be able to lift up our communities, to keep our word when our word is made, and to not break promises casually. That has not so far been the case with this particular issue, but let's walk through the timeline because it's quite a story and it takes a bit to get through. The Prime Minister, as a candidate, and then as Prime Minister, made a very clear commitment again and again and again, hundreds of times in fact, that the 2015 election would be the last election under the first-past-the-post system. Made it so many times Canadians can recite it themselves. Not just the Prime Minister, of course, but every Liberal who stood for office and every Liberal who was elected on that promise. And we in the New Democrats, the Conservatives, the Bloc, the Green, moved in good faith forward on this exercise. Not out of any sense of naivete or lack of information, simply because a promise so clear, so black and white, repeated so often by the leader of a country ought to mean something. And so while this issue is clearly about electoral reform itself, about the idea of making every vote count from every Canadian, regardless of where they live in the country, that is an essential part of this conversation. So that people don't have to vote strategically or cynically or out of fear, but simply vote for what they want, vote for the candidate that they want, and have that vote mean something. And we know around the world that virtually every successful democracy has evolved their way of voting over time to make votes more effective, to not have situations like we did in the last election where 18 million votes were cast, but less than half of them actually went towards electing anybody in this place. That the average vote required to elect a Liberal MP was 38,000. You need another 20,000 to elect a Conservative, more than 20,000 to elect a New Democrat or Bloc, and it was 600,000 votes plus to elect a single Green member. Clearly, from 38,000 to 600,000, even a small child can understand the unfairness of that system. So we moved ahead. We struck the Electoral Reform Committee, made up proportionally, by the way, of how Canadians actually voted in the last election. The committee worked well. It toured the country, every province and territory, open mics, town halls, listening to every expert we could call here in Canada and around the world about the best way to move Canada forward, to make that promise a reality, the promise the Prime Minister made, the campaign commitment that we as New Democrats had, as the Green Party ran on, that 63% of the members in this House ran on, a solemn commitment to Canadians. We produced the most comprehensive report on our democracy in this country's history. Not bad. Unfortunately, the government's first response to it was unbecoming, if we can say that. Yet we persisted. We persisted past, and then suddenly, with a cabinet shuffle and a new minister, there was somehow a mandate letter delivered on high, breaking that promise, as if somehow mandates come out of the Prime Minister's office, as opposed to mandates where they really come from, which is the electorate, which is voters. That's the only place, and should ever only be that place. And for all my friends in the Prime Minister's office, it's good to remember that. It's good to remember who this place actually works for, not some unelected advisor to the Prime Minister, however long they've been friends, but to the people who actually elected people to this House. Now, the evidence was overwhelming in support of proportional representation. Everybody on the committee could understand that because it was so clear. 90% of the experts who testified said if you want to make every vote count, if you want to make the will of voters properly expressed in the House of Commons, you needed a proportional system. And there's many choices under that rubric of different systems that would work for Canada, rural and urban, making sure that our various geographies and our orientations as a country are respected. 88% of Canadians who just came to those open mics, wrote to the committee, filled out our online survey, also expressed support for a proportional system. So 90% of experts, 88% of Canadians who came forward. And yet when the promise was broken, quite cynically, the excuses that the Prime Minister then rolled out in the forthcoming days were extraordinary and somewhat disturbing. First, there was the fear-mongering, because hope and hard work was a slogan in the election. Now the Prime Minister chooses to use more of the fear tactic on this, that extremists would get in if we allowed for a proportional system. Well, the Dutch just proved that not to be the case, where an extremist was running for the leadership of their country, and it was proportional representation in that vote that kept him from seizing power in that alt-right fashion. Then it was the global instability. Donald Trump, I think, is what he was referring to. Well, I'll remind my Liberal colleagues that Americans use first past the post. Then there was this notion that there wasn't a broad consensus, because 90% of experts, 88% of Canadians wasn't enough. And then a fellow from Kitchener decided to start an e-petition, 616, which I sponsored and brought forward to the House. 132,000 signatures, making it the largest petition in Canadian history, came forward saying that this was critical and needed to move forward. So, after all this, cabinet shuffle, a broken mandate and a broken promise, the Prime Minister said, finally, it was my choice to make, and I chose to make it. And in an effort to, I think, appear strong, the Prime Minister proved himself to be fundamentally wrong. It isn't his choice to make. It's Parliament's choice to make. So I know from my Liberal colleagues, many of them sent apology letters to their constituents, wrote op-eds in the local newspaper saying, it breaks my heart that we had to break this promise. I'm very sorry. I really wanted to see this happen. I know my Liberal colleagues never had a vote on this. I don't think they ever stood in caucus and said, who's in favor of betraying this promise? Who wants to keep it? Parliament has never had a vote on this. Parliament has never had the opportunity to weigh in on this initiative, on this effort, on this ability to keep a promise of the 63% of us who are in this House, and to make every vote count. By moving this report, we allow that vote to take place. We allow the conversation to move ahead. We allow, finally, hopefully, a table to be established at which we can negotiate with this government, as negotiations have gone on in British Columbia recently, maybe successfully, we'll find out in a few hours, about the idea that when 60% or more of the electorate want to go in a certain direction, that politicians who are smart and have that core ethic understand that they should listen. Now, hope springs eternal. I was coming up the steps of Parliament today, passing all these school groups that are coming in, the thousands of young people that come to this place. We just saw a bill introduced through the Create Your Canada process from my colleague from Kingsway. The Prime Minister in the last campaign, I think, very effectively spoke to young people, also spoke to Canadians who had grown cynical and tired with the last government, and said we should hope for more, we should expect more. Well, I was on Liberal.ca this morning, seeing if the promise to make 2015 the last election under first past the post was still there. There it is, under the rubric of the title of Real Change, that the Liberals would use evidence-based decision-making, and that Conservatives have lost faith of Canadians. Conservatives have lost the faith of Canadians because they've broken their promises. Well, here's the opportunity. Here's the opportunity for the government to make good. I held more than 20 town halls and events in the last 6 weeks, all across the country, coast to coast. We talked to Canadians, and they're not as cynical as some of the people in the Prime Minister's office. They're more hopeful. They expect and want more from their government. They want this to happen. They support the evidence that we as a committee heard, that we can make every vote count, that we can have integrity in our politics, that we can hold ourselves up to a higher standard. I look forward to the support of my Liberal colleagues, because I know in their ridings that I visited over the last number of weeks, their constituents